The rain had not yet started, but the air carried that charged heaviness that comes right before a storm, the kind of pressure that presses against the lungs and makes every breath feel like a warning. The squad didn't notice. They were too busy arguing over gear, laughing about nonsense, and complaining about a mission they assumed would be routine. Every man on that team had seen combat, but none of them sensed what was coming. None of them sensed her. She stepped off the transport truck without a sound, her boots landing softly on the packed dirt. A few soldiers glanced up from their crates and field packs, giving her the kind of half nod people give strangers they have no reason to remember. They didn't stare long. Why would they? She looked unremarkable. Average height, slim build, dark hair braided back tightly, a gray-green tactical jacket zipped to her throat, no insignia, no attitude. No problem. Just another intel specialist assigned to tag along and gather information no one cared about. That was the belief, at least. She carried only one case, a compact black one that she held as if it weighed nothing, though the sergeant noticed its size and guessed it had some kind of drone equipment. Analysts always brought gadgets. Analysts always slowed things down. Analysts never shut up. They asked questions mid-firefight. They panicked when a twig snapped. They needed babysitting. This one didn't say a word. Specialist. The sergeant grunted, only glancing at her long enough to check she was actually listening. Stay in the center of the formation. You're not here to be a hero. Understood. She nodded once. Not too fast. Not annoyed. Not intimidated. Just acknowledging. Her calm unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The morning briefing ended, and within minutes, the squad moved into the forest, boots sinking into last night's softened earth. The trees formed a thick canopy overhead, filtering out most of the rising sunlight. Shadows stretched between trunks like black bars, the kind that hide movement, hide mistakes, hide danger. The squad didn't notice. They were too confident, too relaxed, too sure they were alone. She walked behind them, not quite in the center as instructed, but one step off to the side, just enough to give her a clearer view ahead. Her eyes scanned everything, the way the leaves trembled, the way the wind shifted, the faint rustle that didn't match any pattern of bird or animal. She didn't reach for her weapon. She didn't tense visibly. She simply processed, calculating distances, angles, escape routes, threat vectors. Her breathing remained slow and controlled. Every inhale was timed, every exhale measured. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't cautious. She was prepared. She always had been. A young private tried to make conversation. So, what's your specialty? Signals, satellite mapping, cyber intel. She didn't answer, not because she was rude, but because she didn't need to. The sergeant shot the private a look that shut him up instantly. Still, the private whispered to the guy beside him, seriously, what's her deal? She walks like she's trained. Everyone here's trained. The other shrugged, not like that. The private wasn't wrong. She moved with purpose, with economy, with a certain controlled stillness. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Her steps were silent, even on brittle twigs. Her posture remained balanced, ready to drop, pivot, sprint, or fire in a split second. Most soldiers didn't notice details like that. She did. She noticed everything. An hour into the trek, the air grew colder, the sky darkened, the wind pushed harder through the branches. Somewhere in the distance, thunder muttered a low threat. The sergeant lifted a fist, signaling a short halt. The squad gathered near an old fallen log, checking maps and hydration. She remained a few paces back, eyes still sweeping the tree line. They didn't know she wasn't checking for comfort or rest. She was checking for danger. They also didn't know she had already identified the ambush point the moment they entered the forest. She sensed it in the unnatural quiet, in the lack of bird calls, in the way the underbrush had been disturbed. She even identified 3 likely positions an enemy sniper might take, but she said nothing, not yet. The squad was not ready to believe her, and besides, she wasn't here to warn them. She was here for what came after. Rain hammered the forest as if the sky had finally split open. Within seconds, the ground became a slick mess of mud, leaves, and panic. The squad fired blindly toward the ridge, their rifles barking desperately into the tree line. None of them had any idea where the enemy was actually positioned. They were reacting, flinching at muzzle flashes, ducking behind whatever cover they could find, nerves fraying with each bullet that cracked past their ears. She wasn't reacting, she was adjusting. She slid her body lower into the cold mud, letting the earth swallow her presence. Her cheek pressed against the wet ground, her breathing steady even as bullets shredded bark inches above her head. She moved like someone who had lived in ambushes more times than she could count. Someone who understood that surviving wasn't about firing fast. It was about firing right. The sergeant spotted her in the corner of his vision and snapped, "Specialist, stay down, that's an order." But the rest of his sentence vanished as a soft, controlled PFFD whispered from her suppressed rifle. A distant figure dropped instantly. The sergeant blinked. His mind fought to process what had just happened. How, where? Another whisper. Another enemy fell. She didn't even lift her head to acknowledge the team. Her eyes followed the movement of rain through the air, watching how each droplet blew sideways. She used the storm itself to gauge wind speed. Her fingers danced lightly across the rifle's dials. 1 click, 2 clicks, a tiny adjustment of elevation. She exhaled, slow and controlled. She fired again. A third silhouette collapsed before it even realized it had been targeted. The team fell silent for half a heartbeat. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was stunned. Then everything resumed. Shouts, gunfire, rain pounding harder. "Who the hell is she?" One private muttered, voice trembling. "Not an intel specialist," another whispered, eyes wide with something between awe and fear. She crawled 3 feet to the left, not because she needed a new angle, but because she knew staying still made her predictable. Delta taught her that. Delta drilled it into her until she could shift positions in her sleep. Rain splashed into her eyes, but she didn't blink it away. She didn't need to. She was already scanning for the next threat. A movement in the brush, barely visible, wind direction, slight cross, gust, distance 230 meters, target speed, slow crouched advance. She fired. The brush stopped moving. The sergeant crawled beside her, his boots dragging awkwardly through the mud. He had to yell to be heard through the rain. "Talk to me, how many?" She didn't look at him. 5 left. He flinched, not at the words, but at the confidence behind them. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't estimating. She knew. A round ripped into the log beside the sergeant, sending splinters flying. He ducked. She didn't. She simply shifted her rifle a precise half-inch to the right and fired. A distant scream was swallowed by the storm. Now 4 left. She leaned forward slightly, her expression as calm as if she were lying on a firing range instead of a battlefield. Her gloved hand steadied the rifle stock. Her pinky finger tapped twice on the trigger guard, a tiny unconscious habit from years of training. It was something Delta instructors noticed early. She had a rhythm to her kills. Another enemy took position behind a tree, aiming toward the squad's left flank. She saw a leaf move, just one. That was enough. The shot punched through the trunk and into the man's throat. Now 3. The squad was no longer firing. They were watching her, mesmerized. Rain slid off their helmets, their rifles forgotten momentarily as they witnessed something they could barely understand. She whispered to herself, not for drama, not for effect, but because it helped her concentrate. Elevation shift, 2 mils, wind steady, distance, 260. She fired again. Another enemy collapsed, 2 left. The sergeant's voice cracked. How are you doing this?" She finally spoke, her tone flat and focused. "Stop moving. You're drawing fire." The sergeant froze. Something in her voice, steady, cold, absolute, told him she wasn't making a suggestion. She was giving a command. The last 2 enemies were grouped near a fallen tree, trying to flank the squad. She saw the blur of bodies through the rain, measured the pattern of their movement, took a breath. Thunder rolled, 2 muffled shots. 2 bodies hit the ground almost in unison. Silence consumed the forest except for the pounding rain. 12 minutes had not yet passed, and 8 men were already dead. She slowly lifted her head from the mud, her eyes scanning for any other threats. She found none. The sergeant stared at her like she had just stepped out of a legend. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered. This time she didn't answer. She was already preparing for the next threat. The storm finally began to ease, but the forest still trembled with the echo of gunfire. Mist curled through the trees like smoke, the smell of wet earth thick in the air. For a moment, the world seemed frozen in the aftermath, the kind of silence that comes only after violence, when the land itself holds its breath. She didn't. She rose carefully from the mud, her movements deliberate, every muscle still listening for danger. Her rifle hung loosely at her side, but her eyes remained sharp, sweeping the ridge, the trees, the shadows. Delta snipers never assumed a fight was over until they confirmed it 3 different ways. And she always confirmed. Behind her, the squad slowly emerged from their hiding places, like men waking from a nightmare they hadn't expected to survive. Helmets dented, faces streaked with mud, hands still shaking. These were soldiers who had seen combat before, but none had seen anything like her. The sergeant wiped rain from his face and approached her cautiously, as if she might vanish if he blinked too fast. He had shouted orders at her earlier, but he didn't shout now. He didn't dare. You took down 8 targets, he said, voice barely steady, in less than 12 minutes. She didn't respond. She was busy ejecting her magazine, counting rounds, checking her chamber, sweeping mud from her suppressor. Routine, efficient, calm, as if she had just completed a standard training exercise instead of saving the entire squad from an ambush they had never seen coming. One of the privates stepped forward, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. That wasn't intel work. He muttered, that wasn't even special operations. His voice cracked, that was. What was that? She finally looked up. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, steady and cold, held something ancient, something practiced, something disciplined far beyond normal soldiering. It was my job, she said simply. The words landed heavy. Too heavy because they all knew that job belonged to only one kind of operator. The sergeant swallowed hard. Delta. He whispered, barely audible under the rain. She said nothing. Silence was confirmation enough. The squad exchanged stunned glances. Fear, awe, relief, disbelief all tangled together. The sergeant lowered himself to sit on a fallen log, hands covering his face as the truth seeped in. We were walking with a ghost. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and scanned the tree line one last time. You're clear, she said, for now. For now. The private repeated nervously. She nodded once. Ambush teams rarely operate alone. They'll have scouts or a secondary unit nearby. The squad collectively exhaled, not in relief but in dread. They had barely survived the first attack. What chance would they have if a second wave came? But she wasn't worried. She'd been trained for this. She walked calmly toward the ridge, her boots sinking into the wet mud, water dripping from her gear. The squad hesitated before following. Halfway up the slope, the sergeant found his voice again. Why didn't they tell us who you were? We could have. She cut him off gently. You weren't supposed to know. He frowned. Why not? She paused, turning slightly so her eyes met his. Rain dripped from her lashes, streaking down her mud-marked face. Because if you knew who I was, the enemy would too. The sergeant had no answer. He realized then that she lived in a world far more shadowed than theirs. A world where identity was a liability and silence was armor. They reached the ridge. From there, the forest below looked peaceful, as if the battle had never happened. Mist drifted among the trees, covering the bodies of the fallen ambushers like a burial shroud. She stood there a moment, taking in the terrain, calculating paths, listening to the shifting wind. Then she turned back to them. We move north, she said. Extraction point is 12 kilometers. We stay silent. We stay tight. The sergeant nodded, not as her superior, but as someone recognizing a leader whose authority came from skill, not rank. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. A faint, almost invisible smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Not pride, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. They began the trek, the squad falling in behind her without hesitation. Every man followed her footsteps, as if they were stepping behind a shield. She moved with purpose through the misty forest, scanning, listening, assessing, her form cutting through the gray haze like a shadow that didn't belong to this world. As they walked, the private whispered to the man beside him, "We're alive because of her." The man nodded, "Yeah, and I don't think we even know her name." The private swallowed. "Does she even have one?" She heard the whisper. She always heard everything, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she tightened her grip on her rifle and kept walking. Her name didn't matter. It wasn't meant to be known. Only her results were, and 8 bodies in 12 minutes. That spoke louder than anything else ever could.